Chapter 1. Part 1. The great temple of Thanae and Agnoruk was built. At the end of the Age of the Damned, it was a work carried out little by little, from humble beginnings, to end up being the largest temple in all of E-Youth. Times. Agnoruk's life in E-Youth. Author, Priestess Balana. His fingers were raw. The last effort had exhausted what little strength he had left. He turned his head and contemplated the landscape, in the background Vale Nevodo, on the horizon the peaks of the Mist Mountains, guarding the whole place in an imposing way but always paying homage to the great Emperor of the North. A huge granite peak that protruded almost unnaturally over all its rock brethren. Agnoruk watched again as the great mountain watched his steps closely, judging him with a certain severity, even though the half-orc was not climbing its slopes. He would never commit such recklessness. Since he was a child he had been warned that the great emperor would not allow them to climb his stony body. The half-orc was climbing the nearest and most benevolent peak. The people of Snowy Valley called him the White Lady. An ascent with steeper ramps despite its considerable height and a much more stable climate for a climb. But it was not a walk either. The gravel and stones that abounded in his bed were obstacles that made the ascent very complicated. It was already the fourth time in the ascent that he had skated down the slope and only his strong hands prevented him from falling off the cliff. He sighed for a moment. Perhaps he hadn't prepared his plan quite well. A pickaxe would have been of great help to him at this moment, instead of entrusting everything to his brute force. To add insult to injury, the ropes were leaving marks on his back, as well as the heavy rock he was carrying. Surely what I was doing was a real stupidity, but there was no turning back. I didn't plan to leave it now after 2 days of non-stop climbing. He focused on the goal, a plain located 200 meters from the summit that they called the viewpoint of the lady. He decisively advanced with a firm and constant step despite the pain. He left his mind blank and concentrated on making sure that each step was safe. Even so, the last meters were torture for his whole body, but he endured with fortitude, managing to reach his destination. Exhausted, the half-orc finally dropped the huge stone. He let out a groan of relief. Seeing the blood on the rock, he didn't need to check that his back was battered and his shirt was totally worn out by the friction with the ropes that held the rock. Agnoruk did not complain and continued with his plan. He took a deep breath and with all his strength lifted the rock to leave it on a natural pedestal that the half-orc a few weeks ago had chiseled so that the rock would have a more stable position. With this show of strength, he placed the rock over his final settlement to fall to the ground exhausted. He began to gasp in pain as he rested his battered back on the pedestal. When he raised his head, there was the stone placed right in front of the great emperor, who seemed to smile pleased. The stone had a cubic shape. The surface was not polished, but on the face of the cube opposite the great mountain he had carved a simple symbol, a circle with 3 smaller circles inside forming an equilateral triangle. The symbol was the same as his tattoo, indicating that he belonged to the tribe of White Orcs, even though he had never grown up with them. The madness of climbing a stone of such size to the viewpoint occurred to him the first time he ascended to the area. When he saw that there was a kind of protrusion in the form of a pedestal, he had the feeling that perhaps it meant that something wanted a kind of altar to be placed on top of it. As he really had little to do during the winter, he dedicated himself to chiseling and molding the piece of stone to make more or less a shape of a cube and chiseling the symbol of the Senefti, White Orcs. After a good rest, he took a seat right in front of the stone cube that was placed in front of the great emperor. Agnoruk placed on top of the block of stone 3 pairs of tusks that when they came into contact with the first rays of the sun dissolved into ashes, which were carried away by the wind in the direction of the great emperor. The half-orc closed his eyes. 2 years had passed since he decided to return to his father's abandoned house. He lived in a solitary way. He had very few interactions with the inhabitants of Vale Nevodo, except when he went down to get provisions in exchange for some furs and savings. Then he would greet old acquaintances, spend the afternoon in the tavern to listen to the news that was being told there. But the novelty is that on the outskirts of the town there was a new temple dedicated to the goddess Thanae, much larger than the previous one, which was only a simple shack. From what he was told about a decade before his return, a new priestess had arrived in Vale Nevodo, who dedicated herself body and soul to the task of expanding the temple. Now a small community of devotees lived inside. Something very strange for a place like Snowy Valley. The Thanae priesthood is solitary and priestly communities were often concentrated in the great capitals of Shanaris.